Chapter 118. "Remember when I said you were going to go further into the rabbit hole than any plebs ever been?" said OJ. "Well, that time is now." We were walking along a corridor at quite a clip. I caught a glimpse through an open door of what appeared to be an enormous spacecraft, gunmetals sleek and striking in its beauty, but they just ushered me past. "You mean back there wasn't it? Not even those..." I calculated for a second. 19 other areas after Area 51, before we got to Area 9.99? 9.99, the General guffawed. "The sign was upside down, you turnip." "Okay, whatever," I said, "but we got cleaning staff back there, even in Area 66.6. But you do a dump here and stain half the bowl, you got to clean it up yourself. Ain't nobody back here gonna do it for you." The air around them had suddenly grown a little menacing, not just grave but hostile. No more the jovial good times of sandwiches and fruit salad. This was serious business, and I needed to fly right or incur their wrath. But God damn it if I didn't need another piss already. Thank God I knew there'd be lavatories wherever we were going. We reached the end of the corridor, a bookshelf full of Dan Brown novels. "Used Dan Brown novels are currently the most economical building material on the planet," said the General. "Half the walls and floors in this place are made from them. A weird thing about you humans, that a man can sell hundreds of millions of copies of a brand new book for what, $10, $15? But once they're in a used bookstore or a Salvation Army for mere cents, you can't give them away." "Nobody reads a Dan Brown book twice," said OJ solemnly. "It's a sad fact of life. I read a couple of chapters once, but it was just painful. He's almost as bad as you. Just another part of the great dumbing down that we're working so hard to combat." The General reached out and counted 7 copies from the left on the third shelf from the top. He looked about him and then pulled the book towards him, then did the same with the copy of Angels and Demons furthest to the right on the next shelf down, then grabbed a half-dozen Da Vinci codes and slid them in and out 3 times. There was a click. "After you," said the General, motioning to OJ. "No, my good friend," said OJ, "after you." And all at once it seemed that their good humour was restored. We were in another corridor now, but clearly one from an earlier version of this part of the base. It almost appeared as something from the 70s, all browns and oranges and paisley wallpaper and carpets. Most surfaces were covered in a thick layer of dust, but when we emerged into the first room I realized, as they had said, it was simply due to a lack of cleaning personnel and/or painters and decorators. I guess when you've got the world's greatest secrets stored down here, you can't just have any old Tom, Dick or Harry in to measure up the curtains or do a quick whip round with a mop. "Wow," I said, as we emerged into a chamber full of upright tubes containing naked bodies. "What is this place?" "This," said the General, "is where we keep everyone of importance. Feel free to look around. That'll make you one of about 33 people to ever enter this room." "What about all the people that worked on the tubes and brought the bodies here?" I asked. The General just laughed. "Questions, questions," he said, wandering into the main hub of tubes. I hurried to follow him, thinking he was avoiding what seemed like a good and pertinent one, but then I saw why he hadn't answered. All around us were small robots with multiple arms and attachments busily attending to the tubes, pushing buttons and checking vital signs, polishing and cleaning, and even constructing new tubes and installing nameplates right before my eyes. "Hey," I said, catching up with the General once more. "If these robots can do all this, why don't you get them to clean the toilets or do a bit of dusting in that entranceway? Seems like they'd even be able to redecorate if someone programmed them to." The General whirled around at me. "Limey," he said, "we just brought you into a place only a few dozen people in history have seen, and even though you've grunt what's in the tubes, you haven't even looked at a single one. All you're interested in is wallpaper and toilets. The hell is wrong with you?" "It's just an idea," I said sulkily, and I thought it was a good idea too, but... I stopped. I stared at the tube I'd come to a standstill in front of. My brain did a complete emergency halt. "What the fuck?" I said. "That's Princess Di." I looked at the General and clocked the satisfied smile on his face. Nice tits, huh? We captured her in her prime. I stared back at the princess. I felt a bit awkward and even rude gawping her at her like that in all her nudity, pushing my face up to the glass to get a good look at her pubic area and seeing if I could get a better angle on the one nipple that was half covered by an arm. But what are they, I said. Dead bodies? Clones? Mannequins? Robots? She looks so lifelike. She looks like she could move her eyes at any second. I pressed my face against the glass and imagined that's exactly what she would do. But England's Rose remained sleeping, in suspended animation, whatever she was, with a placid and serene look on her pale, lifeless face. Something like that, said the General. More interesting than what they are is why they are. Doesn't strike you as odd that all these people are here? I followed him along the row of encased famous people. Everyone was somebody I'd heard of. Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, John Lennon, that cool Pope who died, that woman with the funny face who made people laugh. Geez, I said, I thought Hendrix would be bigger. On and on we walked, and every single person who had lived their life in the public eye and expired before their time was here, suspended in a tube. And in some cases there were multiple versions of them, such as a big-nosed black Michael Jackson, and then a small-nosed white Michael Jackson, and several in between. Hey, I said to the General, did you know that Blame It on the Boogie was written by a guy from Yorkshire, and that he was also called Michael Jackson? And he barely made a dime from that song because his manager screwed it all up for him or something. Of course, said the General. Everybody knows that. And anyway, the Jackson 5's version is much better. So I guess it all works out in the end. I stared at a big-nosed Michael and thought what a shame it was that he'd gone insane and completely butchered his face, despite making a few good records when his nose was small and white. This is the one thing the conspiracy theorists are right about, said the General, pointing out a couple of Amy Winehouses and a Keith Moon. Every single famous person who dies of something other than natural causes is taken out. It's insane to think that somebody like Kurt Cobain would put a gun to his chin, or that Heath Ledger would OD on prescription pills. You really think that Prince died from a fentanyl overdose? Or that Brittany Murphy's life was ended by toxic mold? Think again. But the thing they're wrong about is why and how. Death is not the end, my friend. It never was and never will be. We stopped outside a George Burns tube, and I stared aghast. If there's one thing in the world I don't need to see, it's a wrinkly old man about 200 years of age, pickled in liquid and naked as the day he was born, and with about the same sized penis too. No one needs reminding of the fate that nature has intended for them. Let us live out our youthful days innocent of such things, until it's too late for anyone to actually care. Why'd they put his cigar in there, I said. That seems a bit weird. Wouldn't be George Burns without the cigar, the General said, matter-of-factly, even though it made no sense. The best and the brightest, he added, nodding his head contemplatively. Talking of which, I said, where's OJ? Right here, said the General, indicating towards the tube. Jesus Christ, I said, rushing towards the glass. How did he get in there? How do we get him out? I scrambled frantically around looking for an opening. I pushed a couple of buttons and some lights, but nothing happened. I looked for a robot helper. Nurse, I shouted, unable to think of anything more sensible to say. The General just laughed, and then another OJ appeared from around the back of the tube and joined in the laughter. Fuck me, I said, shaking my head and breathing out as big as I could so as to very clearly signal my exasperation. A regular fucking Morecambe and Wise we have here. OJ and the General looked at me blank-faced. A pair of cannon and balls, I said. A little and large. No response, just more blank faces and puzzled expressions. You two, I said. You're like a comedy duo. That's why I said a regular Morecambe and Wise, a modern-day Badil and Skinner, a male French and Saunders, a slightly more amusing Hale and Pace. Ah, OJ cried. Gareth Hale and Norman Pace. Yeah, I love those guys. Oh, brother, I said, now I've heard it all. We are the management, he lolled. And Yorkshire Airlines, you must know that one. Freaking hilarious. The General just smiled, looking on. That's one area where OJ and I differ, he said. Despite their enormous popularity in the US, I can't say I ever got into them. I'm more of a Barry and Fulcher man myself, Barrett and Fielding. Wait a minute, I said. You're saying you like... The General nodded. And then I noticed we were standing next to a tube marked with the nameplate AC Cowlings. I looked up, from feet to knees to... I skipped over a certain bit there, all the way up to his face. Good old AC, I said, placing my hand solemnly on the glass. Is that really you? Or some duplicate version, like that OJ back there? Handsome fella, said the General. It's almost like looking in a mirror. I nodded absent-mindedly, lost in thoughts of AC, and then I suddenly snapped back to attention. Wait, what? I thought. The General's almost as white as I am, and AC most definitely isn't. What did he mean? It's almost like looking in a mirror. I turned to him and was about to ask when I noticed over his shoulder a series of tubes that took my breath away. We were deep in the center of the complex and must have reached Royalty Row. Some of the headest honchos of all time were pickled right there in front of me. Ronald Reagan, Franklin Roosevelt, the Queen Mother, the Queen herself, Winston Churchill, Norman Wisdom, Catherine the Great, Elvis Presley, and Margaret Thatcher. The crazy thing about Margaret Thatcher, that old iron lady, the scourge of the land where I grew up, where her evil hand had pointed its bony finger at the coal mining industry and wiped it from existence. The crazy thing, I say, about her was, she had the most magnificent pair of tits. Seriously, if she hadn't become our first female Prime Minister, she could have easily made it as a glamour girl or page 3 model, if photographed only from the neck down at least. She was like Jamie Lee Curtis in Trading Places, multiplied by Kate Winslet in Titanic, and then some. Her nipples were 2 grapes you could happily spend the rest of your life nibbling on, juicy and succulent and plump. Her curves were as spellbinding and hypnotic as zooming into the Mandelbrot set when high. It was so incongruous to see those pendulous ripe melons dangling proud beneath her awful witch's face. From the neck down, she was a goddess, and I mean all the way down. But above shoulder height, the only possible use for a face like that was in scaring naughty children into eating their porridge, which I suppose could come in handy from time to time. I shook my head sadly at the thought of all the ugly women in the world with bodies to die for. Who knew what marvels were out there under all those frocks and dresses and hijabs? Paper bag job, I said. That's what my granddad used to call them. But if only he'd known, he'd have given anything to see what I'm seeing right now. And the Martha Stewart one too. He always had a soft spot for her. "Oh, dear Martha," said OJ wistfully. "The stories I could tell you about her. She's a wild one at parties, I tell you that much. I doubt your dead grandfather's soft spot would have remained soft for long if he'd come face to face with the real Martha." I looked back one last time at Maggie. It would be a weird memory to carry for the rest of my life, alternately grotesque and as captivatingly beautiful as the Venus de Milo. Lucky old Dennis was all I could think, the sly old dog. He kept that one a secret, and with the lights off and all sensation focused on the fingertips and pecker, he may as well have been in bed with Linda Lusardi. We had reached the Holy of Holies, the big cheeses, the central circle where all the grandest names resided. I turned around and clocked them one by one. Hitler, Trump, Gates, Genghis Khan, Shatner, Jobs, Scooby-Doo, a little bloke with a glint in his eye, another little bloke, also with a glint in his eye, and a swarthy fellow, and a man and a woman about 8 feet tall, in oversized tubes unique among those I'd seen. and a couple of Chinese-looking dudes, and some strong-looking bearded fellows, and a prepubescent girl, and a blue-skinned hippie stoner, and... That was it. There were no more. I'd whirled in a full circle and was right back to where I'd started, staring at the second most famous Austrian the world had ever seen. The moustache, the hair, the asymmetrical testicle arrangement, the anti-Semitic sneer on his face. But also, despite all that, something of a likeableness about his eyes and his smile, a cheeky chappy vibe, the jest of a lovable rogue, the naughty child who eats all the cookies but who you just can't help but adore, so different to how I'd imagined him. I turned again more closely and read the nameplates around the circle. Hitler, Trump, Gates, Genghis Khan. I'd recognize those. But Shatner was actually Alexander the Great, and the guy who looked like Scooby-Doo was apparently some Aztec ruler in the days before the Spanish had gone over there and conquered them with about 30 blokes and a cold. Then there was Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Adam, Eve, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Plato, Socrates, Joan of Arc, and Krishna. Quite the array, I'll think you'll agree. And pretty cool for a bloke from Yorkshire, 2 days off a Canadian Affair flight and via all the places I've told you about, to be seeing somewhere in the deepest part of the US's most secret military base. But what did it all mean? And why were they showing me these things? The questions burned in my mind, but who would I ask them to? Because, all of a sudden, I was all alone in this sarcophagus of secrets. Chapter 119. So I imagine what you're thinking right now is what kinds of penises all these great men from history had dangling between their legs. And since it appeared I had a bit of time on my hands, I figured I'd take a closer look and make something of an inventory. After all, who knew when it might come in handy? Hitler I've already described, though it was a surprise to note that, ironically enough, he was circumcised. And it really took a closer inspection to spot the lack of right testicle and the scar where, as the song confirms, it had been blown off in the war. Socrates' and Plato's were exactly like those statues I'd seen on school trips to museums as a boy. Silly little things like curled-up baby birds nestled in a delicate fuzz of pubes, and completely in contrast to the godlike torsos they packed, and which I hoped I'd one day grow into as middle age well and truly claimed my body. Jesus was pretty loaded, sporting a length and girth one might ascribe to being pickled 5 minutes after a wank. But something told me this wasn't the case, and that what I was seeing there was his natural state. I thought, the vagaries of nature, to equip a man thusly and simultaneously endow him with a heart and mind that allegedly had no interest in actually using the thing. Musing on him made me wonder if either of his Marys were around here any place, and how neat it would be to check them out in all their naked splendour. Mary Magdalene, I figured, might be one seriously gone chick, if modern-day Israeli army girls / prostitutes are anything to go by. But as for the Virgin herself, I wasn't so sure. Didn't they say she'd had like 5 or 6 kids after Jesus, and maybe lived to a decent old age? So I guess it would all depend on when she'd been plucked and pickled. In the meantime, my eyeballs were alighting on more famous pricks than I'd seen at any time in my life. And I'd seen the Oscars. Oh, God. There was something unusual that occurred to me while I wandered through this chamber looking at cocks. It was that all the people in these tubes were people who were well known in the US, but a lot of famous people who had died early in the UK were conspicuously absent. No Paula Yates, no Tony Hancock, no Steve Marriott or Caroline Aherne, not even a Mark Bolan or Sid Vicious or Nick Drake. And there was an almost complete absence of Africans, Asians, South Americans, Inuit, Polynesians, Australasians, etc. But surely some of their celebrities and rulers also succumbed to early dubious deaths and were worthy of preservation for some unknown future occurrence? Or did the Illuminati mainly focus its attentions on the US and people that the US had heard of, and causing all its mischief there? I mean, how was it that they had a Dustin Diamond but no Michael Hutchence or Jill Dando? It also struck me as odd that, though 90% of them were people who had died before their time, there was also a small selection of those that hadn't, and some, Trump, Gates, Stephen Hawking, the Queen, for example, who were still alive. Plus, why were there so many mega-famous and outspoken people who didn't die in weird circumstances, who weren't pickled here, when you'd think they'd be just as likely to be targeted, if not more so, than the Paul Walkers or Brian Joneses of this world? Michael Jordan was still alive, Mick Jagger was still alive, Pele and Maradona and Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo were still alive, even Charlie Sheen and Keith Richards were still alive. There had to be some logic to the whole thing, but what it was, I couldn't quite put my finger on. And in the absence of no one around to ask, I internally shrugged the shoulders of my mind and mainly concentrated my energies on perusing the wide variety of penises and tits and fannies, like any normal person in my position would. Tupac's was long and slender, almost exactly equal in dimensions to one of my middle fingers. Biggie Smalls, situated next to him, had a tiny little micro-penis mostly hidden under rolls of fat, and barely any testicles to speak of, the poor thing. No wonder he ate so much, the fat bastard. Oh, an old dirty bastard had an extra penis growing out of the side of his actual, completely normal penis, a small addition, more like a clitoris than another penis. And it occurred to me, where he could have had it removed actually as well, if he'd wanted to, but for some reason that only he could explain, he'd decided to keep it. I'd never even heard of such a thing. It was something to add to the list of things I could Wikipedia when I next got online. Martin Luther King's was a whopper. Abraham Lincoln's had a large mole on it. Steve McQueen's looked like it could lift weights. James Dean's pointed at about a 45-degree angle to the left. The best, though, by far, was Stephen Hawkins's. The thing was like a corkscrew or a pig's tail, curling around on itself in a spiral and hanging down into the seat of his wheelchair like the weird hair things Jewish guys have dangling down the sides of their heads from under their hats. Where the hell was a camera when you needed one? I could have stayed staring at that thing all day. It was like looking at a Fraser spiral illusion. It seemed to always be in motion, and even though I knew it wasn't, I could only ever confirm it by blinking several times and concentrating with all my might. What kind of being was he? Was it anything to do with his high IQ? Though Einstein's was as standard and run-of-the-mill as most men's. I got into a real groove looking at those penises, had my system down. It was just a step to the left, an initial check, and then a few seconds to try and guess whose it was before reading the nameplate and saying in a surprised tone, "Oh," or "Ah," or occasionally and most wonderfully, "I knew it." And then one last look up to cock and face before moving on and repeating the whole sequence again and again and again. A funny thing happened somewhere in the middle of all this. I came upon a standard sub-average wee fella nestled under a hairy gut. I guessed John Belushi or maybe Andy Kaufman, but when I looked down I saw that the nameplate read Melinda Gates. I looked back up at the penis and confirmed it really was a man's penis, not a woman's, and then checked the face and saw it was none other than everyone's favourite orcan and poetry teacher, the late, great Robin Williams. What was he doing in Bill Gates's wife's tube? Weird, I thought, especially since the whole place is run and organised by presumably infallible robots. And then, speak of the devil, just as I was musing on this and about to move on, one of the little droids zoomed up to the tube and plugged one of its appendages into the USB port. A click and a beep, and the fluid began draining out, and pretty soon some larger robots approached from the back and removed the Robin Williams, who I was sure I saw blink. And in another few seconds, he was replaced by a woman I didn't recognize. But if I had to guess, I'd have said she was Kevin Kline's twin sister. Immediately the fluid returned, and the robots zoomed away as quickly as they'd appeared. It was a model of efficiency, and I nodded my head and hummed in approval. despite knowing that silently thinking impressed thoughts and keeping my head still would have sufficed. And then, with enough penises feasted on and nothing much better to do, I went back to stare at Maggie Thatcher's tits some more, and that's where I found AC and OJ. But wait, did I just type AC and OJ? Indeed I did, and this time it wasn't a mistake, which means... Chapter 120. AC, I shouted, rushing up to him and throwing myself into his arms. You sly old dog, last time I saw you were... That's right, said OJ. He was asleep in my cell. Wasn't it strange the way he passed out like that? Must have been all the action at the Peacock Ranch, right, old buddy? OJ cajoled AC and gave me a hard stare. All right, I said, giving him an extra squeeze. AC, for his part, wasn't exactly returning the hug, but nor was he resisting. How does AC talk? I don't know. This cockamamie-limey, he laughed. Every time we're apart for more than 5 minutes, he has to hug me and greet me like I've been raised from the dead or something. Go on now, he said. Let me breathe. I took a step back and looked at him. This was the real AC, all right. No weird tube-based replica, but... Say, AC, I said, why are you wearing the General's uniform? AC looked proudly down at all the bands and colours and stripes and gave them a stroke. What? This old thing? He said. Yeah, I just passed the General on my way in here and we did a swap. Turns out we're exactly the same size fitting. What are the chances? About 1 in 33, OJ piped up, clearly pleased with some sort of joke, but one I didn't get. So the General was here with OJ, I said, and then he left but swapped clothes with AC on the way in because... You guys are the same size? And AC came here from OJ's jail cell because... I tried to turn it over in my mind for a few seconds, but the whole thing was too unwieldy, too ungiving, like a brick I couldn't quite get my spatula under, and so I gave it up. Luckily, OJ was there to explain. Exactly right, he said. Okay, I said. So what's next? OJ started walking to the exit and talking, and AC followed, and for want of anything better to do, after granting myself another 10 or 20 seconds to admire Maggie's breasts, I trotted after them and tried to catch up. Which is why we have them all here in these tubes, he was saying, and why we had to show you. Though, of course, I didn't need to spell all that out for you. You'd have realized it clear enough during your alone time. Right, I lied. Now as to why AC's here, he continued, nearing the door. You remember when I said you and he had work to do? Yeah, I said. And you remember when I told you that far from being an old handbag salesman who mostly just potters around, doing nothing and lives on the fame of having once driven me really slowly down a freeway, he's actually an undercover operative who carries out some of our most critical and dangerous tasks? What? I said, failing miserably at hiding my puzzled expression. OJ gave me the hardest of stares. Oh, yeah, sure, I remember, I said, feigning nonchalance. But what of it? Well, it's almost time for you two to do what the whole thing has been leading to. But first, he said, we need to get you prepared. We were back in the shag-pile hallway with the peeling paisley wallpaper. But given OJ's mood, I figured it was best to keep quiet and not repeat my OJ dear, about getting the robots to redecorate. Still, my mind did start to wander and try to think of other ideas of how they could fix up this space, which really was in stark contrast to the entire rest of the complex. Like maybe they could get some workers in and have them assassinated immediately after. Or, better yet, put a wanted ad out for interior designers and painters and decorators who were suffering from terminal illnesses and pay them a fortune to come in just before they expired, and they could have a nice little earner to pass on to their families and they wouldn't be around to tell anyone. Or maybe... You thinking about the wallpaper, OJ said. No, not really, I said. Well, you should, he said. That's the work I want you and AC to do. Strip this all down, Pull the carpets up, lay a nice floor, bring a bit of brightness to the space, install some new lighting too. I looked at AC, nodding along. Really, I said. That's the whole reason you flew me from England, got me to break into America and drive down to Nevada and come here in area God knows what, to do some DIY? OJ laughed. No, not really, he hooted. Oh, limey, he said, you'll fall for anything. I furrowed my brow at him and grew a little cross in my heart. That stung, and the number of times they'd play with my mind really was reaching a critical mass by now. No more, I vowed. Next time they led me down the garden path on some wild goose chase, sniffing after red herring, I was out of there. A hard resolve took root in my soul. Fuck these guys. AC must have picked up on it. He put his arm around me and nudged me back into good spirits. No, limey, he said. What we got in store for you and I, is a bit more important than painting some walls. But one step at a time. First, OJ pushed a door open in front of us. We entered what looked like a large control room with hundreds of screens. In the middle sat a desk with what was presumably the master computer. It was much the same as any old normal computer, with monitor, keyboard, mouse, and mousepad with the corner peeling off. But something about its sleek, minimalist design and the way it sat there waiting, so pristine and otherworldly, told me there was something more to this computer than met the eye. You heard of the deep web, OJ said, ushering us in. Sure, I said. I even went on Silk Road once, about 5 years ago, thinking about buying a sheet of acid. But it was all bitcoins, and bitcoins were like 12 quid a pop, which seemed a bit ludicrous and risky for something that doesn't actually exist. If only I'd known, I said. You heard of the dark web, he said. Isn't that the same thing, I said. Not quite, said OJ, but no need to get into that now. What about the even darker web? Or the really dark web? Or the meta web? Nope, I said, not heard of those, but I have heard of MetaBunk. I've been a member of that for a year or so. And suddenly it hit me. MetaBunk, the internet's premium conspiracy theory debunking website, where some of the smartest people I'd ever encountered showed categorically over and over again that the conspiracy theorists were wrong. How could I be sure it was what it claimed to be? The paranoid nutjobs were convinced it was part of the so-called, and I'd always presumed imagined, controlled opposition. But now I didn't have a clue. Were they in on it? Were my interactions with them foolish, given that I hadn't been in on it, and maybe still wasn't? Or were they oblivious too, wasting their time debunking things that OJ's shady organization, I still figured it was something to do with the government, but even that I was starting to question, something that they were busy putting into the minds of the unstable and the gullible. All I knew was that I for sure as shit didn't know. And suddenly I had this horrible notion that I was the only one who didn't know, that the whole world was one giant setup, that every single other person on the planet was part of the act and pretending to be something, even those who were pretending to not know and to pretending to be wrong. What about my best friends, my family, my girlfriends and lovers? How could I know for sure that they weren't part of some elaborate cosmic joke, or actors, or spies, or, shudder the thought, alien robot space lizards intent on twisting my melon well beyond the range of how far a melon could safely be twisted? Could it really be a giant Truman show, and me, the one true man, at the center of it all? Was that why that movie always made me feel so strange and excited? Why it spoke to me and seemed so real? Or maybe the whole thing, the whole of my life and the stuff of the world, was just a dream, a hallucination, or I really was a brain in a jar on some mad scientist's shelf, being experimented on and played with, everything appearing real because that's the way it always does, but no way to tell if it's actually real, since it's all just my own perception, registering in my own brain, with no way to know for certain whether something genuinely exists outside my senses of sight and sound and smell and taste and touch. Now who was the paranoid weirdo? I shook my head and tried to clear my thoughts. I'd taken about 3 or 4 minutes to go through all that, and I must have looked a complete loon to AC and OJ, suddenly going silent and blank-faced, only to finally come out of it with a vigorous headshake, but they just watched and waited patiently. Nah, I thought, other people are real. They're not just part of my dream. I'm not just a brain in a jar. The world is a thing, and the faceless strangers on the internet I've never met nor can confirm are actually not just one person or a bot, are probably as they seem. People like myself typing things so as to make themselves feel smarter than others, and generating that nice satisfying feeling when someone else is wrong and you're right. Which means that they don't know. Which means that they're spending their lives as uselessly as someone who's dedicated themselves to debunking Santa. Holy shit, I thought. But what if Santa was actually real, and they had him back there in one of those tubes? Why hadn't I checked? I detected a look of panic spread across my face, which I attempted to rein in. Then I realized it was now 6 or 7 minutes since I'd last said anything, despite having just entered this marvelous room that clearly had some significant meaning for the strange journey we were on. I needed to get myself back to normal. I needed something of the everyday world to hold on to. I needed... "Remember those bathrooms you were talking about?" I said. "Can I use one before we get into this? I need a shit. And a piss, probably." "Actually," said AC, "me too." OJ just rolled his eyes and tutted. Then he looked thoughtful for a second. "Yeah," he said, "I should probably go too. Who knows when the next opportunity's gonna be." And he led us back out the room and back into the corridor, and one by one through a door marked Gents. Chapter 121. AC and OJ took up their positions at the urinals, or urinals if you prefer. OJ legs apart and hands on hips, oozing confidence, while AC's stance was somewhat more feminine and gentle, and I went and sat in one of the free cubicles situated behind them. Despite the general's warning, the toilets were clean and fragrant, and I nodded impressed at the ample supply of triple-ply toilet paper that awaited the juicy brown kiss of my bumhole. "So as I was saying," OJ said as he splashed his presumably warm urine onto the white porcelain bowl from out of the end of his old man's penis, "there's the meta web, and then there's a web beyond that, and then one last layer of web beyond that." "The meta web," I said, squeezing my bowels together and trying to force out a poo. I didn't want to leave them waiting, and I felt that if I could poo as fast as they could pee, it would impress them and show them that I was capable of running with the big boys. But, alas, no poo was forthcoming. "It doesn't have a name," said OJ, "but we call it Q, for no real reason other than because it amuses us. There are 3 computers in the world that can access Q. One here, one at my place in Brentwood, and another that's been missing for some time now. Let's just say that it fell into the wrong hands and that we'd quite like to get it back. But I will come to that later." I heard him washing his hands. Damn. Though AC, I noted, was still standing there trying to pee. Perhaps I could still beat one of them. And there were faint signs of a shit on its way. "Come on, baby," I willed it. "Let's show them that there's life in the old dog yet." "So what's this Q-web?" I said, grimacing hard and scrunching down on the seat. It was happening. The shit was pushing its way through. "Just Q," said OJ. "To call it part of the web would be to do it a disservice. It does have that aspect to it, and that's what you'll be seeing soon." Oh, my shit was done. Now all I have to do was wipe. But AC was close to finishing peeing too. "But it's more like the deepest web. The meta web, as you call it, is a part of it." "A small part," AC said, zipping up his fly just as I was standing from the seat. In a series of swift moves, I pulled up my trousers, opened the door, and raced to the sinks. Whoever finishes washing their hands first is the winner, I thought. That's where the finish line is. I can still pip him at the post. AC leisurely rubbed the soap between his fingers and palms and absent-mindedly let the water trickle over him while he continued. "We don't actually know what Q is," he said, "or where it comes from, but we can access the small part of it that exists in this dimension. As far as we ourselves experience, there are 10 dimensions, but it seems that Q exists even beyond that, into the 11th dimension for sure, and maybe the 12th. As for beyond that, it's—" "I win," I shouted, shutting off the tap and raising my hands in the air. "Silver medal for me!" "Oh, very good, Limey," AC said nonchalantly as he finished rinsing the soap from his digits and shutting off his own tap. "But did you remember to flush?" I wandered over to the toilet and looked in. God damn it, how do I keep forgetting that? Is that what happens when you get older? I could have sworn I'd pushed the handle, but this forgetting to flush was happening more and more frequently. Sadly, I flushed the shit and relinquished my silver medal. "Just give it a scrub with that brush right there while you're at it," said AC. "There's a good boy." "Leave it as you found it," chimed in OJ. "Or even better, leave it nicer than you found it. That's our motto here in the Bureau." He turned to AC and clasped him on the shoulder. "I think that medal's going to look nice on your chest," he said. "Look like there's room for one more there, just about." AC stood to attention and clacked his heels together in an impressively soldier-like manner. "Yes, sir," he hollowed, saluting proudly at the same time, and out they went, arm in arm, giggling like the old friends they so clearly were.